Welcome to Just UX. Welcome back if you're already a subscriber. Today's video is going to be kicking off a new series where I'm going to be walking you through how to create some common design system components. We're going to start with the text input, one of the most widely used components and useful components. And I'm going to show you how to use some of Figma's new features and functionality in order to build the most flexible, scalable, and easy to use input component that you can really, or that I can. So let's not waste too much time, let's jump into the video. So before we dive into actually pushing pixels around and creating that component, first thing I like to do is actually map out exactly what it is we're going to build. And this falls into two parts. First, the subpart list. If you think of subparts, they're basically the individual layers and shapes that are going to make up the actual structure of your component. And secondly, we've got our states, our interactive states. These are the actual states that can be manipulated through interacting with your component. So hover, could be pressed. Here we've got default, hover, active, field, and error. And we're going to walk through those as we start the design process. Anyway, we've got this checklist set up. I've explained a bit how I'm going to work. So let's dive into actually creating the component. So the first thing I'm going to do is just create an artboard. What are these? These are 16. I'm just going to make it the same because I'm OCD. I'm going to call this playground. So we're going to do all of our initial design work and our initial concepting on this playground artboard. And we're going to go through this list of subparts. So just for a bit of clarification, I've done some preliminary work and you can copy this file. I'm going to leave the link to this file so you can have access to the same setup that I do, but I basically just defined some text styles and I defined some color styles just to save a little bit of time. So let's create the top label using body medium. We're going to create the input container by pressing A to toggle the frame tool and just drag out a frame. It's going to be 40 pixels tall and 200 wide, though generally the width doesn't matter too much. We're going to give it a border radius of 8. And we're going to give it a stroke, a border of decoration light, which we have defined here. I'm going to give 8 pixels between the top label and the main input container. Then I'm going to go ahead and copy this top label, and this is going to be our input text as well. So let's call that input text. Finally, another thing I forgot to mention, I've already got some icons that I added to the file. You can use whatever icon set you want, whether it's custom or you're using an established icon set like material icons or whatever. I think these are feather icons, but I can't remember. So let's add an icon for the right hand side. What's going to make sense here? It's usually a dollar icon arbitrarily. It could make sense. We're going to give it 12 pixels right margin, and it's going to be 8 from the top and 8 from the bottom because it's 24 pixels and it's on a 16 pixel grid. So yeah, we'll make sure this is 12 as well. And then we're going to copy and drop this. We're going to give it 4 pixels from the bottom, and we're going to make this one body small. So as you can see already, we've got the top label, the input container, the input text, the right icon, and the hint text. I'm just going to go ahead and modify the colors. This is going to be our default input. I'm not using pure black, I'm going to use this dark ink. For the input text, I'm just going to use this decoration color because it's just placeholder for now. Similarly for the icon and default state, I'll use I'm going to use the same one. I'm going to use this darker decoration color, and then for the hint text, I'll use ink light. All right. So now let's start using auto layout and some other Figma functionality to make this a bit tidier and a little bit more flexible. So first thing I'm going to do is select the input container and the hint, and then hit Shift A to create an auto layout. I'm going to go over to the layers panel and just name this input container and hint. And then I'm going to create another auto layout with top label, and I'm going to show you why I did this in a while, and we'll just call this one input because this will be our main input wrapper. So as you can see, this has got 8 pixels, which is the space we talked about earlier. This has got 4, the same like we talked about earlier, And we actually want to create another nested auto layout, which will be the container itself. So we're going to hit Shift A again. And boom. Yes. So we don't want this to be fixed, this value, because we want to be able to change the width of the component and for it to maintain its integrity. I'll show you how that works later. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually wrap this text in an auto layout, another auto layout, just by Shift A. I actually don't want any height or side margin, so I'll just hit 0 and 0 there. But what we do want is this to fill container. And then we're going to change, we don't want all of that space between items. We only want about 8 pixels, so we'll hit 8. And what you'll see has happened is this has grown, and irrespective of how you resize this container, this will always be 8 pixels away from the icon, which is really useful. I'll just reshape this. The next thing we want to do is make sure everything's set to fill. We want the parent container to be fixed, but everything inside it should be set to fill. So this should be set to fill, this should be set to fill. And that means if we modify the parent container, everything's just going to fill up the max width. Everything's going to sort of fill the parent container, so it's nice and easy to resize. And it should just make sure the text is set also to fill container. The text should also wrap, yep. And that's how we want it to behave. So we've pretty much now got this basic default text input looking pretty decent. I'm going to go ahead and just ungroup it because we're going to start creating components. So we've got this basic one. Good point. I forgot to add a background. Let's add a white background. Now I'm going to highlight this, click on this parent container, and I'm going to hit Option Command K, and that's going to create a component. And then we're going to go ahead and we're going to add, using this plus button here, we're going to add 5 variants, or you can just hit the plus button here. I'm going to set this as an auto layout and then just push it, just so it's easier to work with. And then I'll give the actual board a color of white. So now if we think about these interactive states we talked about earlier, this will be default, this will be hover, this will be active, this will be filled, and this will be error. And what we're going to do, because we've got 5 variants, this is going to show up as 5 variants with this property. So the property is going to be interactive state, and it's going to be default, hover, active, filled, and error. And now we're going to go ahead and just manually update the styling for each of these different interactive states. So for hover, we don't want any drastic change. All we're going to do is just darken the border, just to give a little indicate that something's happened when the user's mousing over. And that should be fine. For active, we're going to go a bit more explicit in regards to the stylistic change. So the first thing we're going to want to do is change the border color. So if you imagine you've tapped on this input, you're ready to enter some data, you want it to really clearly show that it's active. So we're going to give it this primary blue border. We're also going to make the hint text blue. We're going to make the icon dark ink, and we're going to make this text dark ink. We're also going to use a little hack to create the text input indicator. So what we're going to do, we've got this auto layout we created earlier. We're going to hit this, which allows you to independently manipulate each padding, and we're going to give 4 pixels on the left, and then add why did I do that? Yeah, we're going to add a stroke just on the left. Again, you can use this independent stroke setting here. It works the same as the padding that I just used on auto layout, and I'll just apply it to the left, so it kind of looks like a text indicator. It's just a nice little hack. So that's looking pretty good. But one other thing I want to add that I think looks really cool for active states is like a focus ring. So it's going to be like a double border. Unfortunately, you can't stack borders currently in Figma, so we're going to use another little hack that I learned. So we're going to hit R, create a rectangle. We're going to add this rectangle to the active version, And we don't want it just to sit as part of the auto layout. We actually want it to move independently and sit outside of the flow of the auto layout. So we're going to use this little feature called absolute positioning. So click that and you'll see it falls out of the flow of auto layout. And what we can do now is position it 2 pixels outside of the main input container. So I'll do it there, so 207. And we're going to give it 10 pixel border radius because it's 2 pixels on the outside and we want it to look like it's got the same curvature as the main container. So you want to give it a slightly larger border radius than the nested object. But you can see it's kind of not working. It's not working. So we actually want to drag this in the layers panel into the input container and hint auto layout because we want it to exist within this section. And you see as I've dropped it in, it's fallen behind the input container. That's because we have here last on top. If we went first on top, it would switch over. We want last on top. We're going to modify some of the properties here just to make sure that it expands and collapses correctly as you modify the sizing of the text input. So I'm going to set it to this light primary blue first, and then I'm going to use the constraints to stick it to the top and then the left and right. And what that's going to do is mean that even when I adjust the width, this focus ring is still going to maintain its position. It'll look okay. Curvature looks good. And I'll show you why I want to position this at the top, because basically this is now nested within this parent frame. It's not part of the auto layout, but it is still sticking to some constraint rules. And we want it at the top because one thing we're going to do is allow this hint text to be toggleable on and off. And if it was set to the bottom, if I went here, I can't change it here. Let's change it here. If I set this to the bottom, what would happen is when I turn off the hint text, it would lose its place because it's judging its position based on where it is from the bottom of the parent container. So we want it to judge its position based on the top. So we'll just make sure it's set to the top. And now if I turn on and off this hint text, you're going to see it's going to maintain its position. So it's kind of behaving okay. It looks good. We've got the active state done. I think it looks pretty sick. So let's just do the last 2. We need a filled. I don't know what's going on here. I want a filled one. So for the filled one, we just want to make these both ink dark so you can clearly see the data that's been inputted. And for the error state, what we're going to do is just again make the text dark so you can see where the error is coming from, and then make the border this nice error red. So boom, we've got it all styled. I need to stop toggling this sidebar. I've got a really sensitive mouse pad. Cool, so we've got it all styled. We've got all of our subparts included. We've got all of our states defined. The next thing is to use some of this Figma functionality to make the component really flexible and allow us to turn on and off all of these subparts that we initially defined. So the first thing we want to make toggleable is the top label. So we'll click until we've highlighted this top label, this text layer, and then we're going to select all the matching layers. And what that's going to do is going to activate all of the matching layers on all of the other variants. And then we can manipulate them all at once instead of having to do everything laboriously one by one. So first thing we want is a layer Boolean property, I think they're called, component property. So we'll call this top layer. And by default, we want it true because what this property is going to do is toggle the visibility of that layer. And we want it visible because most of the time we're going to want a top label. So we're going to leave it true as default. And we're also going to create a component property for the text, and we're going to call this again top label, but I'll just indent it with an arrow. I'll just call it label. See, it's changed all of the text to label, and it's going to allow us to do something cool, which I'll show you later. So we've done it for the top label. Let's do exactly the same thing for the input text. Just make sure that you click down to the text layer and you're not manipulating the auto layout that we created. So text layer is selected. Layer here, we'll call it input content. Again, we want it as true because 9 times out of 10 you're going to want a placeholder or some content in your input. And then we're going to go ahead and do this text property, do the arrow, and we'll call it input content. Next, we're going to do this for the icon. Can we toggle? Just make sure that the one thing we're going to do, because I've just noticed if we turn off this icon, you're going to get some weird resizing of the height. So we just want to make sure that the input container itself has a fixed height. So select the input container, again, select all variants, and instead of it being hug, we'll just set it to fixed height. And now, when we turn on and off the icon, yeah, it should be fine. So again, we're going to highlight all of the icons, create a property, and we'll call it icon. Keep it true, we'll keep it on by default. And we're going to use another type of property now. It's called an instance swap property. And if you select the instance of the icon here, I'm sure you know you can manipulate these from the properties panel. But you can create a property using this, which is also really cool. So again, we're going to use the arrow and icon. And I'll show you how that works in a minute. So we've set up properties for the top label, for the input content, for the icon, and finally we're just going to do exactly the same thing for the hint text. So let's call it hint, and then again hint. Now let's show you what that's actually done. So we're going to drag out an instance of this text input component. Let's give a bit of space so you can see how it works. Call this example. I'm going to pull it down. So let's select it. First, we can go through the interactive states: hover, active, filled, error. All look really good. But then we can go ahead and turn on and off all of these different properties that we just defined. So we can turn off the top layer. We can turn off the input content. We can turn off the icon. Not only can we turn off the icon, but we can also use this other instance swap property to actually modify the icon directly from the panel here instead of having to drill into the nested layers. So we can set it as an arrow right, or maybe a drop down in case you want to use this as the parent container for a drop down. And then we can turn on and off the input text. So in a few minutes, we've built this really scalable, easy to use component using these awesome features that Figma's introduced. So this is our first component done. We've already got a text input. Next in the series, we're going to go through buttons, checkboxes, a bunch of other really useful components. So I hope you enjoyed this. Let me know what component we should cover next, or what components you're currently building if you'd like a video on them, and I'll try and get that done ASAP.